So you modernists don't like get comfy and think, oh yeah, well I've got typed documents that prove such. And yeah, you do. Nobody lies. Do you see the peril of being a historian?
People stopped lying in the Enlightenment. What are you talking about?
Oh yes, all of our archive, archive in the present is all completely reliable and truthful.
Yeah.
And nobody lies.
Yeah,
Nobody lies in recordings. You can tell exactly what happened when, I don't know, Nick throws that drink in the In-N-Out because it's perfectly framed by, oh wait, the person who took the video. Was it staged? Who knows?
Yeah, so it's a media issue.
Always.
So Christianity is a media issue.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Fantastic. And then we have the difficulty in deciding whether or not the medium of the church is trustworthy, or we're going to fall on an external medium that is not the church for our understanding of the historical timeline.
Yep.
And whether or not things are trustworthy.
Yep.
Fascinating. So there we come to the point of the church being the platform of Christianity, and without that, we lose our historicity. And then we are entering into... Where are we going?
We're back in the dream time.
We're
back in dream time. And this is, so now I hope everyone understands why it's so frustrating to be caught in these sola scriptura arguments. Because I mean, the example that you gave at the beginning, where you're saying, you know, how did the church decide which books are in the... Well, what we have is the evidence of the physical thing, and then the physical things carry text, which say things, which tell us stories, which we then have to, you know, evaluate on the basis of, you know, those canon tables, right? I'm going to go back to the canon tables. You know, comparing across different versions and so forth of what, you know, we say, well, like if they all agree, it definitely happened. Okay, you were talking about the red letter stuff. So there was a project, I think it kind of evaporated a while ago because it was silly, but to the so-called Jesus Project, which was going to go through and by vote figure out exactly which things Jesus actually said. It was Dominic Crossan and some others. I think some of them were Loyola Jesuits, right? They're gonna, which I don't dislike Jesuits, but they were going to vote by way of committee.
True to everyone.
Yeah, which parts of the Gospels were actually accurately historical.
Democracy strikes again.
You know, we're all, it's like when we said Christianity is a media problem. That was what McLuhan's point ultimately was. In the incarnation, you know, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us was the ultimate media claim that it's the one moment in which the medium was the message. The Word became flesh, truthfully, right? Absolutely. It's like there's the surround sound and media environment of the incarnation is, but you know, we're gonna go nuts and completely go crazy if we don't have, I don't know, it's interesting. The tradition is actually more reliable than the texts themselves, because the texts come out of whatever this process was in the past.
Well, I'm thinking now on the madness of Western culture in its current incarnation. The status quo for Westerners right now is that we are not looking at the church as the medium of our culture. We're looking at everything else as the medium of our culture. So, if that's the case, we're constantly having to deal with, again, it goes back to the previous conversation we had about the rolling wheels of fan fiction, but this is essentially compiling a narrative via committee that has divorced itself from a desire for unification with Christ. So then the argument is human nature sufficiently reliable in its unredeemed form to be able to compile narratives that are trustworthy, versus putting our faith in the compilation of the Bible from a community that sometimes took hundreds of years to write documents down for us. You know what? Do you know what I mean? I'm not sure if I've described this very well.
Well, I understand what you're saying, and it's exactly right. That's exactly the problem.
That lag time between the apostles walking around with Christ and then the beginning to write everything down and to compile the Gospels and get everything into a written form requires it requires faith and trust that community were honest enough and reliable enough to have compiled their narrative accurately and historically. Now, people could say, well, you're putting a lot of trust in those people, but what you've described is that Western civilization without the church is still doing the same thing.
Yep.
We're still falling on a consensus of committee to create our narratives for us. So in both cases, we have faith.
Right.
There's no difference, there's no distinction, except for whether or not we're willing to have faith in the people which were within the early Christian church, or whether or not we're going to fall on people which are rejecting the church completely.
Well, so well said. The irony of all of this is that the reason that Christians care and the reason that we care in Western civilization is because of the incarnation. That we, and I have said this before, it's like history as we're talking about it now, this need to prove that Jesus was historically real is itself folded into faith, right? That, like, if we want the Jesus in history, and we're going to go through all of these, proof texts of figuring out exactly when the oldest manuscript was, and exactly, I'm showing Jesus revealed here, but wait, go back to the canon tables, right? That we do this exercise of comparing the different texts. All of this apparatus of scholarship is developed by Christians because it matters to make the claim that Jesus entered into time in the way that we believe. So the sort of trying to disprove Christianity by way of the technical methods of proof that were developed by Christians to prove the incarnation, it tends to collapse on itself. I mean, but the hilarious thing to me is it's like if you don't believe in the reality of the incarnation, you shouldn't believe in the reality of any history by this point, because even our dating of the manuscripts is problematic. But that the ancient world exists only in copies of texts made in, usually like the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. We don't have older versions of them. So they literally could have all been, and this is for my historiography class that I'm doing in the winter for the undergraduates, the Tartaria problem. They just, the guy who writes the Tartaria argument just goes straight with that. It's like all of it's written in the 11th century. There's no ancient past. It's all completely invented in the 11th and 12th century. Never mind Christianity, right? There's no Rome. Maybe there's some rocks, but what do you know about rocks, right? This is fundamentally the problem for history, that we only know what we know because it's in language. Two, it's somehow transmitted to us into the present. Is it myth? Is it history? Like the Tolkien stuff that I've done is also, sort of playing with this problem of which stories do people find most believable?
Because it's not just a story; it's a storyteller, isn't it?
Yes. So the fundamental sort of uncertainty that we want to give you in this context is if you pick up this kind of book, open it up, and say it says here, therefore you have to live by it. The book itself tells you more. So I've been showing you in the slides the sort of support apparatus for the Codex Amiatinus. The Codex Amiatinus, on the one hand, it's all of those books, right? But it also has framing instructions for what to think about what this book is, because you don't know how to read the Bible. I guarantee most of us don't know how to read the Bible. I've spent my whole life trying to learn how to do it, and I keep writing little books that hopefully show bits of it and part of the tradition and part of the practice and liturgy and stuff like that. But the Codex Amiatinus is a very interesting book because it tries to show you how to read the book. And the first thing is, here's Ezra with his collection of different volumes. Okay, so this book contains a whole library. It's like your original iPad, right? My iPad contains like all the books that I read. So the Codex Amitinus is like this big pan book, right? It's going to contain all of these books that Ezra put together. Okay, so there's Ezra with his books, and then go past the papyri. And then we have, very interestingly, a number of other introductory pages, including, and this I love, right? It's absolutely wonderful, this purple page. Making purple books was a thing. We have some Carolingian books that are completely purple, but in the Codex Amitinus, there's one folio, one turn page that's purple. And it's like got on one side, what happened to the rest of my notes? Oh, there they are.
Princess Purple Rain.
They're Princess Purple, right? The purple. on one side, it has a prologue, and it talks about, you know, how to read, what this book is, right? How to read the scriptures, and it says it's the Old and New Testament stuff. And you have one side and then the other, and on the back side, it has a list of the books, okay, that are included in this book. And then the next thing that you see in this book, if you're turning the pages, is an image of the tabernacle, which is the place where the Hebrews worshipped in the desert after they flee from Egypt. And the tabernacle has a veil, right? And in this image, the veil is on the outer court, but it's like this purple page is showing you to read this book correctly, you have to pass through the veil. You have to pass through the interpretive frame to know what it is that you're looking at. And guess what? The interpretive frame is the worship. It's the liturgy. It's exactly what you were saying those Ethiopian guys said in the video, right? You can't just pick up the scripture and read it. There's a frame of understanding that you have to come to it with, that you therefore know what it is you're looking at. And indeed, this book is not a novel. You don't sit down and read it from cover to cover, although you can. It's a practice, right? And the practice is what you bring to the worship that we do in the modern version of the tabernacle, which is the church. So there's, you know, the sacrifices and the singing and so forth. So we've passed through the veil into the tabernacle. Now we're going to figure out how to read the book, which we then get like the Old Testament, all the Old Testament, and then we get to the end of the Old Testament, Maccabees, and on the back of the same folio at the end of Maccabees, we have this image that I'm showing now, which is the revelation of Christ. It's the Maestas. And Christ is shown in heaven, surrounded by the angels, so he's like the ark, but surrounded by the four Gospels. So we only see Christ clearly through the harmony of the Gospels, which we then get the canon tables for, right? So there's this whole repertoire of frames that you go through in order to get to the place where you understand what kind of story it is you're reading. We have, okay, so now the chat's woken back up.
There's the veil. On in and out.
In and out of the veil, right? So, yeah. Mel, script and papyrus created the social environment we think of in connection with the empires of the ancient world. McLuhan, yes, absolutely. Okay, so we've gone through the veil. You're back. You're sitting in front of your gold veil.
I got my cross as my anchor. So
right.
I'm going in and out.
Right. And the thing is, modern Bibles tell you this kind of thing too, but most people don't think of all of that, right? It's like. I mean, well, the problem with Genesis is it doesn't say who wrote it, right? But we've got prefaces. Actually, this Bible doesn't have enough. You don't just sit down and read this. You come to it through this whole interpretive frame to get to the point where you can be engaging with it in the way that it makes sense.